The room did not fall silent immediately. At first, there were whispers, the soft shuffle of feet, the faint sound of chairs adjusting as people settled into their places. This was not an audience waiting for a performance. These were friends, colleagues, family members, all carrying their own private weight. Rob Reiner's funeral was meant to be restrained, dignified, almost minimal, a farewell that reflected the man's preference for sincerity over spectacle. Yet no one in the room could escape the feeling that something fragile was about to surface. They did not know when or how, only that it would. Billy Crystal sat near the front, hands folded, posture composed in the way someone looks when they're trying very hard to remain functional. From the outside, he appeared calm. He had stood on countless stages, spoken in memorials, awards ceremonies, televised tributes. He understood public grief better than most. But this was different. This was not a colleague. This was not even a lifelong friend in the conventional sense. Rob Reiner had been woven into Billy's life for nearly half a century, present at turning points, both visible and invisible, moments the public would never know about as the service unfolded. Names were spoken, memories shared, a careful rhythm maintained. People smiled softly at familiar stories, nodded in recognition, wiped their eyes discreetly. The atmosphere was heavy but controlled, like a held breath. Billy listened, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the podium, not avoiding emotion but containing it. Those who knew him well recognized the signs. He was bracing. When Billy was invited to speak, there was no dramatic introduction, no list of accomplishments, no attempt to frame the moment. He stood slowly, as if his body needed time to catch up with the reality of what he was about to do. The room shifted. Even before he said a word, something changed. People leaned forward instinctively, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. They sensed that whatever was coming would not be polished. Billy began simply, his voice steady at first. He spoke about the first time he met Rob, about how easily laughter came between them, how conversation never felt forced. He shared small, human details, the kind that never make it into documentaries. Late-night phone calls, jokes that went nowhere, but somehow mattered anyway. The room responded gently, a ripple of warmth moving through the silence. This was familiar territory for him. He knew how to guide people here. But then his cadence shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. He paused longer between sentences. His words slowed, not for emphasis, but because something inside him was catching up. He stopped looking outward and began looking inward. He spoke about moments when Rob had shown up without being asked, when he had listened without fixing, when he had understood without explanation. These were not stories meant to impress. They were stories meant to survive. That Billy's voice cracked for the first time, not on a grand declaration, but on a sentence so ordinary it stunned the room. He said that Rob knew when he was not okay before Billy himself did. The simplicity of that truth landed hard. There was no laughter this time, no shifting, no coughs to break the tension. The room went still, as if everyone had collectively decided not to interfere with what was happening, that he tried to continue. You could see it in the way he straightened slightly, in the familiar instinct to regain control. He took a breath, began another sentence, and then stopped. This time, the pause was different. It was not intentional. It was the sound of someone reaching the edge of what they had prepared for and finding nothing there. His hands trembled, just enough to be noticed. His eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with the effort of holding them back. And then it happened. Billy broke down to "It was not loud." It was not dramatic. There was no sobbing, no collapse, no need for assistance. It was quieter than that. And because of that, more devastating. His shoulders sank slightly, as if the weight he had been carrying finally found gravity. His voice disappeared for a moment, replaced by silence, so complete it felt intentional, even though it wasn't. No one moved. Not a chair, not a program, not a breath that could be heard. The silence did not feel awkward or uncertain. It felt protective, as if the room itself understood that interrupting would be wrong. This was not a moment to be managed. It was a moment to be witnessed. Billy looked down, then up, eyes glistening, and said softly that he did not know how to say goodbye to someone who had been there for almost his entire adult life. He admitted that there were parts of himself that only existed because Rob had seen them first. That without Rob, the world felt louder and emptier at the same time. These were not lines. There was no rhythm. There was only truth arriving unfiltered. Someone near the back began to cry quietly, then another. But no one tried to fill the silence with reassurance. No one rushed him. They let the space remain open, honoring the vulnerability unfolding in front of them. This was grief without armor, stripped of timing and polish, and it demanded respect. When Billy finally spoke again, his voice was weaker, but clearer in a different way. He said that Rob had taught him that friendship was not about constant presence, but about reliability, about knowing that someone was there even when you did not reach for them. He said that kind of bond does not end cleanly. It lingers. It complicates. It hurts that he finished not with a joke, not with a summary, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the years. Gratitude for the laughter. Gratitude even for the pain, because it meant the love had been real. When he sat down, there was no applause. None was needed. The silence returned, but this time it was changed. It was heavier, deeper, and shared at in that moment. The funeral stopped being a formal goodbye and became something else entirely. It became a collective acknowledgement of loss that could not be managed or minimized. Billy Crystal's breakdown did not disrupt the service. It defined it, and long after people would leave the room, that silence would remain, echoing louder than any words that could have filled it. After Billy returned to his seat, the room did not immediately recover its shape. People remained suspended in the moment he had created, unsure whether to exhale or remain still. The silence lingered not as emptiness, but as presence, thick with shared recognition. Many had attended expecting dignity, reflection, perhaps even carefully curated warmth. What they received instead was something far rarer. They received truth, uncontained and unprotected, and it shifted the emotional gravity of everything that followed. Those seated closest to Billy could see the effort it took for him to compose himself again. He did not wipe his eyes quickly or force a smile. He sat as he was, allowing the moment to finish its work on him. That choice alone communicated more than any closing sentence could have. It told the room that grief did not need to be hurried, and that composure was not a requirement for respect. In a space filled with people who had spent their lives performing control, that message landed deeply. The service continued, but it moved differently now. Speakers who followed did not change their words, yet their tone softened. Their pauses lengthened. They spoke less about achievements and more about presence, about phone calls returned late at night, about encouragement offered quietly, about Rob's ability to make people feel seen without drawing attention to himself. Billy's vulnerability had recalibrated the room. It had stripped away the instinct to impress and replaced it with the permission to be honest. For many in attendance, the breakdown unlocked emotions they had been suppressing since the news of Rob's passing first arrived. They had told themselves to be strong, to stay composed, to manage their reactions in public. Watching Billy let go dismantled that internal rule. It reminded them that grief is not something to be mastered. It is something to be allowed. Faces softened, shoulders dropped, tears came without apology. Several people later said that what struck them most was not that Billy cried, but that he did not apologize for it. He did not try to explain it away or wrap it in humor. He let the moment stand as it was. That refusal to minimize pain felt radical in a culture that often treats discomfort as a problem to solve. In that refusal, there was respect. For Rob, for himself, for everyone else in the room. The silence that followed his breakdown was different from the quiet that preceded it. Before, it had been careful, almost ceremonial. Now it was intimate. It felt shared rather than imposed. People were no longer just witnesses to a service. They were participants in a collective emotional truth. That shift could not be undone. It carried through the remainder of the ceremony, shaping how every word was received. Those who had known Rob casually felt something shift as well. They realized that they had underestimated the depth of the relationships around him. They had known the public version of Rob Reiner, the filmmaker, the storyteller, the cultural figure. What Billy revealed was the private Rob, the friend whose influence extended beyond work and into the core of people's lives. That realization expanded the sense of loss beyond professional admiration into something more personal, more human. After the service, conversations were quieter than expected. There was no rush to analyze what had happened. No one asked whether Billy had planned the moment or lost control. Those questions felt irrelevant. What mattered was the honesty of it. People spoke in lowered voices, as if continuing to respect the silence had established. Some hugged without speaking. Others simply nodded, acknowledging that words were insufficient. Several attendees later admitted that they replayed the moment in their minds repeatedly. Not because it was shocking, but because it felt instructional. It demonstrated something about grief that few public moments ever do. That it is not linear. That it does not respect schedules. That it does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it surfaces quietly, unexpectedly, and asks only to be witnessed without interference. For Billy, the breakdown marked a threshold he had not anticipated crossing publicly. Friends would later say that he had debated whether to speak at all. He worried about holding it together, about becoming a distraction, about drawing focus away from Rob. What he did not anticipate was that his vulnerability would become one of the most respectful tributes of all. By allowing himself to be seen in pain, he honored the depth of the bond they had shared more truthfully than any polished speech could in the days that followed. Word of the moment spread, but it traveled differently than typical headlines. People did not describe it as dramatic or emotional in the sensational sense. They described it as real, as grounding, as something that reminded them of losses in their own lives. The image of Billy Crystal, usually associated with laughter and ease, standing in silence, undone by grief, resonated because it stripped away expectation and left only humanity. What lingered most was the way the room had responded, not with discomfort, not with pity, but with stillness. That collective choice spoke volumes. It demonstrated that when grief is met with patience rather than urgency, it can deepen connection rather than fracture it. The silence became a form of care. Rob Reiner's funeral would be remembered for many reasons. For the life it honored, for the stories shared. But for those who were there, and for many who later heard about it, the defining moment would remain the one that was never scripted. The moment when Billy Crystal broke down and no one tried to stop him. When the room went silent, not out of shock, but out of understanding. That silence did not end when the service did. It followed people home. It surfaced in their own moments of loss. It reminded them that grief does not require permission, and that the most powerful tributes are often unplanned. In that way, Billy's breakdown did not overshadow Rob's farewell. It illuminated it, revealing the depth of love that existed beyond titles, beyond careers, beyond words. As the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, many in the room were still processing what they had just witnessed. It was not simply that Billy Crystal had broken down. It was that the breakdown had punctured a long-standing illusion about how grief is supposed to look when it belongs to people who live their lives in public. The expectation of grace under pressure had dissolved, replaced by something more honest and far more unsettling. People realized they had been holding themselves to standards that no longer made sense in the quiet aftermath. Several attendees found themselves thinking back to earlier losses in their own lives, moments when they had swallowed emotion to remain appropriate. Watching Billy release control without apology stirred regret for words unsaid and tears deferred. It also brought relief. If someone so familiar with stages, cameras, and expectations could allow himself to be seen in that state, perhaps the rest of them could stop policing their own grief as well. The service ended without fanfare. There was no musical swell designed to guide emotion, no formal dismissal. People rose slowly, as if standing too quickly might break something fragile. Billy remained seated for a moment longer than most, head lowered, breathing, steadying. When he finally stood, those nearest him did not rush forward. They gave him space, understanding that the moment still belonged to him. Respect, in that instance, meant restraint. Outside, the light felt harsher than expected. It was the kind of brightness that makes eyes ache after time spent indoors. People shaded their faces, adjusting back to the world, carrying something intangible with them. Conversations were subdued. No one joked. No one checked phones immediately. It was as if the silence inside had followed them out, wrapping itself around the group as they dispersed. Those who spoke with Billy afterward noticed a difference in him. Not weakness, but openness. He did not attempt to deflect or minimize what had happened. He acknowledged it simply, saying that some losses refused to stay contained. He spoke about Rob not as a legend or collaborator, but as the person who had known him before the world did, who had laughed with him before anyone expected it, who had stayed when others drifted away. Saying goodbye to that kind of presence, he admitted, did not come with instructions. Over the next few days, the moment began to circulate quietly among those who had not been there. It was not described as a scene or an incident. It was described as a pause, a silence, a man standing without words because words had finally failed him. That framing mattered. It preserved the dignity of the moment, preventing it from being reduced to spectacle. People who heard about it often responded by sharing their own stories, not about Rob Reiner, but about their own friends, mentors, and losses that had never been fully expressed. Billy's vulnerability created a permission structure that extended far beyond the funeral. It reminded people that grief does not have an expiration date, and that composure is not a measure of love. For some, the most striking detail was the lack of intervention. No one stepped in to rescue Billy from his silence. No one tried to smooth the moment over. The collective decision to let it stand was powerful. It suggested a shared understanding that certain moments cannot be improved by management. They can only be honored by attention. That understanding stayed with people. In the days that followed, it surfaced in unexpected ways. In conversations where someone paused longer before speaking. In meetings where emotion was allowed without embarrassment. In personal moments when someone chose not to rush past discomfort. The silence from the funeral became a reference point, a reminder that presence can be more supportive than reassurance. Billy himself would later reflect privately that the breakdown had surprised him. He had not planned to lose control. He had planned to honor his friend. What he realized afterward was that honoring Rob meant allowing the truth of their bond to appear, even when it was inconvenient, even when it disrupted expectations. In that sense, the moment was not a failure of composure. It was an act of loyalty. The loss of Rob Reiner had already been significant. He was a figure whose work shaped culture and whose influence spanned generations. But the way he was mourned, particularly in that unscripted moment, added another layer to his legacy. It showed the depth of connection he fostered, the kind that does not dissolve into professionalism when the work and as people return to their lives. The image that lingered was not of a famous comedian overcome by grief. It was of a friend standing at the edge of language, refusing to retreat into performance. That image challenged assumptions about strength and vulnerability. It suggested that strength might actually reside in the willingness to be seen when control falls away, in that sense. The moment at the funeral did more than honor Rob Reiner. It reframed how many people understood mourning itself. It reminded them that grief is not something to be delivered cleanly or efficiently. It arrives when it arrives, and when it does, it deserves space. Billy Crystal's breakdown did not demand attention. It did not ask for interpretation. It simply happened, and the room responded with care. That response, perhaps more than anything else, revealed the kind of community Rob had built around himself. One that knew when to speak and when to remain silent. Long after the service ended, that silence continued to speak. It spoke in the pauses people allowed themselves, in emotions they no longer suppressed, in the understanding that love, when it is real, leaves marks that cannot be managed away. And in those marks, Rob Reiner's presence endured, not as an icon, but as a catalyst for honesty. In the weeks that followed, the memory of that moment continued to surface in unexpected places. People who had attended found themselves recalling it not as a scene, but as a feeling, a quiet pressure in the chest, a reminder that something honest had passed through the room and left a trace. It was not the kind of memory that demanded retelling. It was the kind that lingered, reshaping how people understood what they had witnessed. Several attendees later admitted that they had initially underestimated the depth of Billy Crystal's bond with Rob Reiner. They had known they were close, of course, but closeness is often assumed rather than examined. The breakdown forced a reckoning. It made visible what had always been there, but rarely articulated. Friendship not as convenience or collaboration, but as continuity, as presence maintained over decades, surviving shifts in career, geography, and public attention. Billy himself became more reflective in the days after the funeral. He did not speak publicly about the moment right away. When asked, he deflected gently, redirecting focus back to Rob. But in private conversations, he acknowledged that something had shifted inside him. He had spent much of his life turning pain into humor, tension into release. This time, he had not been able to transform the feeling. He had been forced to sit with it, to let it exist without translation. That experience unsettled him, but it also clarified something he had not fully recognized before, that he realized that Rob had been one of the few people in his life who had never needed him to perform. Around Rob, there was no expectation of wit or timing. Silence was allowed. Uncertainty was tolerated. That kind of acceptance is rare, especially for someone whose identity has been shaped by audience response. Losing it left a void that could not be filled by routine or distraction. Others who knew Rob well recognized the pattern immediately. They spoke about how Rob had a way of making people feel unobserved in the best sense. Seen, but not scrutinized. Valued, but not evaluated. That quality explained why so many people responded so strongly to Billy's moment. It was not just grief for a man. It was grief for a space that no longer existed. The silence at the funeral had done something else too. It had stripped away the hierarchy that often governs public mourning. Titles, accolades, and reputations receded, leaving only relationships. In that silence, it did not matter who had sold the most tickets or delivered the most memorable performances. What mattered was who had been there when no one was watching. That recalibration was subtle, but it was profound. People began to talk differently about Rob Reiner after that. Less about his influence, more about his impact. Less about what he made, more about how he made people feel. The distinction mattered. Influence can be measured. Impact cannot. Billy's breakdown shifted the conversation toward the latter, inviting a more intimate understanding of loss. The moment also sparked private conversations among those who had long avoided discussing their own grief. Watching someone so practiced in public composure lose his footing without consequence challenged the unspoken rules many had internalized. It suggested that vulnerability, when met with care, does not diminish respect. It deepens it. Billy would later tell a friend that the hardest part of the moment was not the crying itself. It was the realization that he could not explain his pain without flattening it. Language failed him, and for someone who had built a career on language, that failure was disorienting. But it was also honest. It honored the depth of what had been lost rather than reducing it to something manageable. The room's response remained a point of reflection for many. No one tried to rescue him from the silence. No one filled it with platitudes or reassurance. That restraint was not accidental. It was instinctive. People understood, perhaps without articulating it, that the moment belonged to Billy and to Rob, and that interference would only dilute in a culture that often rushes to fix discomfort. That collective stillness stood out. It modeled a different way of responding to pain, one rooted in presence rather than problem solving, in attention rather than advice. That model lingered long after the chairs were folded and the room emptied. For Billy, the memory of that silence became something he carried with him, not as embarrassment, but as confirmation. Confirmation that the bond he had lost had been real, substantial, and worthy of mourning without apology. It reminded him that grief is not a weakness to overcome, but a testament to connection. As time passed, the intensity of the moment softened, but its meaning did not. It continued to surface when people spoke about friendship, about aging, about the losses that accumulate quietly over a lifetime. It served as a reminder that some relationships do not announce themselves loudly, but when they end, they leave a resonance that cannot be ignored. In that way, Billy Crystal's breakdown became more than a moment of personal grief. It became a mirror, one that reflected the cost of deep connection and the courage it takes to acknowledge that cost publicly. It showed that even those most skilled at entertaining others are not immune to the weight of loss, and that when they allow themselves to be seen in that state, it creates space for others to do the same. Rob Reiner's funeral was intended to be private, restrained, almost quiet by design. But the truth that emerged within it was anything but small. It expanded the room, deepened the silence, and left those who witnessed it carrying something they had not expected. A reminder that the most powerful moments are often the ones that cannot be rehearsed, and that when grief is allowed to speak in its own language, it leaves an imprint that endures. As the memory of the funeral settled into something more reflective than raw, many who had been present began to reassess what they believed they knew about grief, especially grief expressed in public. The expectation that loss should be neatly contained, dignified, and resolved within an allotted time frame suddenly felt artificial. Billy Crystal's moment had exposed that assumption as fragile. It showed that grief does not ask permission, and that when it arrives, it often ignores context entirely. Several attendees later described a sense of relief they had not anticipated. Relief not because the moment was easy to witness, but because it felt honest. For years, many of them had learned to translate pain into productivity, to show up smiling, to keep moving forward without pause. Watching someone as experienced and respected as Billy allow himself to stop disrupted that internal script. It suggested that stopping, even briefly, was not failure. It was acknowledgement. The silence that followed his breakdown continued to be discussed in private conversations, not as an awkward gap, but as a shared decision. People recognized that something collective had occurred. Without coordinating, without instruction, the room had chosen stillness. That choice required trust. Trust that the moment did not need management. Trust that presence was enough. In hindsight, many saw that as a reflection of Rob Reiner's influence. He had been someone who trusted people to meet moments without control. Billy's relationship with Rob became a focal point for those trying to understand the depth of the reaction. They spoke about the way Rob had supported Billy during career transitions, during moments of doubt, during periods when public success did not align with private certainty. Rob had not tried to solve those moments. He had simply stayed. That kind of steadiness creates a bond that does not announce itself until it is gone. For Billy, the days after the funeral were marked by an unusual quiet. He did not rush back into work. He did not fill his schedule to avoid feeling. He allowed the absence to register fully. Friends noticed that he spoke more slowly, listened more carefully. Humor still surfaced, but it was gentler, less defensive. The breakdown had not diminished him. It had clarified him. He reflected privately on how often he had used humor as a bridge, a way to connect without lingering in discomfort. At the funeral, that bridge had not been available. There was nothing to soften, nothing to redirect. The loss was direct and uncompromising. Sitting with that reality was unfamiliar, but it felt necessary. It honored the relationship in a way that wit could not. Others who had known Rob, recognized the pattern. He had been someone who allowed people to show up as they were, without expectation. He did not demand performance or reassurance. He offered attention. That quality explained why the silence felt appropriate rather than tense. It matched the environment Rob had cultivated in his life, a space where authenticity was valued over efficiency. That AS stories continued to circulate quietly. People began to draw connections between the moment and their own experiences. They remembered funerals where they had felt pressured to say something meaningful, to present composure, to support others while suppressing themselves. Billy's breakdown reframed those memories. It suggested that perhaps the most meaningful contribution is sometimes to let grief be visible, to allow others to recognize their own pain in it. The impact of the moment extended beyond the circle of those who had attended. Friends who heard about it secondhand described feeling unexpectedly moved. They imagined a room, the pause, the collective restraint. It contrasted sharply with the way public moments are often described, filled with analysis and reaction. This moment resisted that impulse. It remained intact because it had not been overexplained. Billy eventually spoke to a close friend about the fear he had felt just before losing control. Not fear of judgment, but fear of revealing how much Rob had mattered. That fear surprised him. He realized it came from years of conditioning, from the idea that intensity should be managed, that depth should be moderated. Letting go of that in front of others felt risky. But the response he received affirmed that the risk had been worth it. The room's reaction stayed with him, not as validation, but as reassurance. Reassurance that grief, when met with care, does not need to be hidden. It can exist without becoming spectacle. That realization altered how he approached conversations about loss afterward. He became less inclined to deflect, more willing to acknowledge pain directly. This shift did not make him heavier. It made him more present as time moved on. The moment at the funeral became less about Billy and more about what it revealed. It revealed the cost of deep friendship. It revealed the limits of language. It revealed the power of collective restraint. These revelations did not demand action. They invited reflection. Rob Reiner's legacy continued to be discussed in terms of films, influence, and cultural impact. But among those who had been there, another legacy took shape quietly. The legacy of a man who had created spaces where people could be fully themselves. The silence at his funeral was one such space. It was not planned. It was not instructed. It emerged naturally, shaped by the relationships he had built. Billy Crystal's breakdown did not define the funeral on its own. It integrated into something larger. A shared understanding that grief is not a disruption to be managed, but a truth to be honored. That understanding lingered, influencing how people approached their own losses, how they allowed others to grieve, how they sat with discomfort without rushing to resolve it in that way. The moment did not end when Billy sat down. It continued, unfolding quietly in the lives of those who witnessed it. It altered expectations, softened defenses, and expanded the definition of respect. It showed that sometimes the most meaningful tribute is not what is said, but what is allowed to remain unsaid. As the weeks unfolded, the memory of that silence continued to echo, not as a dramatic highlight, but as a point of orientation. People found themselves referencing it without naming it, using it as an internal guide for how to respond to loss in their own lives. The lesson was not about restraint alone, but about permission. Permission to pause. Permission to feel without narrating. Permission to let grief exist without converting it into something productive or presentable. Billy Crystal became increasingly aware of how the moment had shifted his own internal landscape. He noticed that when conversations turned toward Rob, he no longer felt the urge to protect others from his pain or to translate it into humor. He allowed emotion to surface naturally, trusting that those who listened could hold it without needing resolution. This trust felt new. It required vulnerability, but it also fell aligned with the kind of friendship he had lost. He spoke privately about how Rob had always resisted the pressure to rush through discomfort. In rehearsals, in writing rooms, in personal conversations, Rob allowed silence to do its work. He believed that some truths only arrive when given space. That belief had shaped their friendship, creating a foundation where neither felt required to perform for the other. Losing that space made the silence at the funeral feel both painful and familiar. Others who had been present began to recognize the same pattern in their own relationships with Rob. They remembered moments when he had listened longer than expected, when he had waited instead of responding, when he had allowed uncertainty to remain. These memories reframed the silence at the funeral not as absence, but as continuity. It was a reflection of how Rob had lived, not a deviation from it. The impact of Billy's breakdown also prompted conversations about masculinity and grief, particularly among men who had been taught to equate composure with strength. Watching a respected figure allow himself to be undone without apology challenged those assumptions. It suggested that strength might include the willingness to be seen in pain, rather than the ability to conceal it. This realization resonated deeply, especially among those who had long avoided their own unresolved losses. Some attendees later described feeling unexpectedly grateful for the discomfort of the moment. It forced them to confront emotions they had been postponing. It disrupted routines of avoidance. In that disruption, there was opportunity to acknowledge grief that had been waiting patiently for attention. Billy's vulnerability had acted as a catalyst, not by instructing, but by modeling. The absence of commentary during the silence remained one of its most powerful aspects. No one attempted to frame it, to explain it, to soften it. That collective restraint required confidence. Confidence that the moment did not need guidance, that could stand on its own. This confidence mirrored the trust Rob had placed in people throughout his life. He trusted them to find their way through complexity without control. Billy himself reflected on how rare the kind of trust is. In many settings, especially public ones, there's an instinct to manage perception, to ensure that moments land correctly, to shape response. At the funeral, that instinct had fallen away. What remained was authenticity, unfiltered and unscripted. That authenticity felt like the most accurate tribute possible. A.S. stories of the moment spread quietly. They were often accompanied by a sense of relief. People felt less alone in their own experiences of loss. They recognized that even those who appear most capable of managing emotion carry grief that resists containment. This recognition fostered empathy, not pity. It humanized rather than diminished. Billy noticed that the breakdown had altered how people approach him afterward. There was less expectation for him to be entertaining, more willingness to sit in silence. Conversation slowed. Listening deepened. The shift did not feel like distance. It felt like respect. It allowed him to show up more fully, without the armor he had worn for so long. He acknowledged privately that part of his fear before speaking had been the possibility of overshadowing Rob. He worried that his own emotion might draw focus away from the man they had gathered to honor. What he realized afterward was that the opposite had occurred. By revealing the depth of his loss, he had illuminated Rob's impact more clearly than any summary of achievements could have. The silence had spoken volumes about the kind of relationships Rob cultivated. Relationships rooted in presence rather than performance, in patience rather than urgency. Those qualities had shaped not only the moment at the funeral, but the way people remembered him afterward. They spoke less about what he had done and more about how he had been as time continued. The memory of Billy Crystal standing in silence became less about him and more about what it represented. A refusal to rush past pain. A willingness to let truth appear without decoration. A collective understanding that grief does not need to be efficient to be meaningful. That understanding influenced how people approached subsequent losses. They allowed themselves more space. They resisted the urge to fill silence with explanation. They trusted that presence was enough. In this way, the moment at Rob Reiner's funeral extended far beyond the room in which it occurred. It became a reference point for a different way of mourning. Billy carried that reference with him. It did not resolve his grief, but it reframed it. It reminded him that the pain he felt was proportional to the love he had lost, and that there was nothing wrong with letting that be seen. The silence had held him when words could not. And in that holding, he found a measure of peace. Rob Reiner's life had been defined by storytelling, by shaping narratives that resonated across generations. The moment at his funeral told a story too, one without dialogue or structure. A story about friendship, loss, and the courage to remain present when certainty dissolves. It was not a story that demanded retelling. It simply remained, quietly influencing those who encountered it as time went on. The silence from that day began to take on a different quality. It was no longer sharp or raw. It became reflective, almost instructional, as if it continued to teach those who had witnessed it how to sit with what cannot be fixed. People found themselves returning to it in moments of their own loss, recalling how no one rushed in, how no one tried to make it better, how the absence of words had somehow made space for truth to exist without interference. Billy Crystal felt this shift internally as well. The grief did not lessen, but it became less combative. He stopped trying to wrestle it into something manageable. Instead, he allowed it to move through him at its own pace. Some days were easier, others unexpectedly heavy. He learned not to interpret those fluctuations as progress or regression. They were simply part of the terrain. Rob had once told him that grief is not a problem to solve, but a landscape to learn. That idea finally made sense. In conversations with close friends, Billy spoke about how Rob had been present during moments when he himself felt invisible, when success was loud and confusing, when applause felt hollow. Rob had been the one to ask quieter questions. Questions about meaning, about fulfillment, about whether the life being lived still felt like one's own. Losing that presence felt like losing a compass. The breakdown at the funeral had been the moment Billy realized just how central that guidance had been. Others who had known Rob recognized similar patterns in their own memories. They spoke about his ability to ground people, to pull them back from performance and into sincerity. He was not impressed by noise. He valued clarity. That clarity often came after pauses, after reflection, after letting discomfort settle. The silence at the funeral mirrored that approach so precisely that it felt intentional, even though it wasn't. The moment also began to influence how people spoke about mourning publicly. There was less appetite for polished tributes, fewer expectations of eloquence. People began to value authenticity over articulation. Billy's inability to continue speaking at that moment did not diminish the tribute. It completed it. It communicated what words could not. Some attendees later admitted that they had initially feared the silence. Fear that it would feel awkward, that it would expose vulnerability they were not prepared to confront. Instead, they found it stabilizing. It removed the pressure to respond correctly. It allowed them to simply be present. That experience stayed with them, reshaping how they approached difficult conversations afterward. Billy noticed that in interviews unrelated to the funeral, he was more willing to pause before answering. He no longer felt compelled to fill every space with wit. Silence had become less threatening. It felt like a place where honesty could surface if given enough room. This shift surprised him. He had built a career on timing and delivery. Now, he was learning the value of restraint. He spoke privately about how Rob had encouraged that restraint long before. Rob believed that not every thought needed immediate expression. Some ideas benefited from incubation. Some emotions needed time to clarify themselves. The funeral had forced Billy into that practice publicly. While uncomfortable, it felt true to the relationship they had shared. As the story of the moment continued to circulate quietly, it resisted simplification. It was not framed as a collapse or a failure. It was framed as a pause. That framing mattered. It preserved dignity. It allowed the moment to remain human rather than sensational. People responded to it with respect rather than curiosity. The silence also changed how people remembered Rob's work. They revisited his films with new eyes, noticing the patience in his storytelling, the space he allowed scenes to breathe, the way he trusted audiences to feel without being instructed. The connection felt obvious in retrospect. The man who had valued quiet moments on screen had created a life that honored them off screen as well. Billy found comfort in that alignment. It reassured him that the breakdown had not been a departure from Rob's values, but an expression of them. Rob had always believed that the most meaningful moments are rarely tidy. They resist scripting. They arrive when they are ready. The funeral had followed that logic, even in grief. Over time, the moment became less about loss and more about continuity. It demonstrated that relationships do not end cleanly. They leave imprints that surface in behavior, in choices, in the way people respond to absence. Billy carried those imprints forward, allowing them to inform how he lived rather than trapping him in what had been lost. The collective memory of the silence began to function like a shared language among those who had been there. They did not need to explain it to one another. A glance, a pause, a mutual understanding sufficed. It became a point of connection, a reminder of something honest they had experienced together. In this way, the breakdown did not isolate Billy. It connected him more deeply to others, invited empathy rather than distance. It allowed people to see him not as an icon, but as a friend in mourning. That shift felt meaningful, even if it was not something he had sought. As the months passed, the silence at the funeral remained present, not as a wound, but as a reference. It reminded people that grief does not need choreography, that love does not require explanation, that sometimes the most respectful response is to stop talking and allow what is happening to happen. Rob Reiner's funeral had been designed to be quiet, private, restrained. What emerged from it was something deeper than ceremony, a moment that stripped away expectation and revealed connection in its rawest form. Billy Crystal's breakdown was not the story itself. It was the opening through which the truth of that connection became visible. And long after the chairs were gone and the room had returned to its ordinary function, that truth remained. It lived in the pauses people allowed themselves, in the silences they no longer rushed to fill, in the understanding that grief, when met with patience and presence, can deepen rather than diminish the bonds it reveals. As the season shifted and daily routines reasserted themselves, the moment at the funeral began to settle into memory with a quieter authority. It was no longer replayed with intensity, but remained present as a subtle guide, influencing how people navigated moments of loss and uncertainty afterward. The silence had not demanded attention, yet it continued to shape it, reminding those who had witnessed it that some experiences resist being summarized and are better carried than explained. Billy Crystal felt this influence in ways that surprised him. He noticed it when he chose not to rush through conversations that brushed against grief. He noticed it when he allowed pauses to stretch without anxiety, trusting that meaning would arrive on its own time. These shifts were small, almost imperceptible, but they marked a departure from habits built over decades. Habits shaped by stages, timing, and the expectation of response. The breakdown had loosened those habits, creating space for something more deliberate. He spoke privately about how Rob had been one of the few people who encouraged him to sit with uncertainty. Rob did not offer quick reassurance. He asked questions that lingered. He believed that answers earned through patience held more weight than those delivered immediately. Billy recognized that same patience in the room's response at the funeral. It felt like a continuation of Rob's presence, manifesting through the people he had influenced. Others reflected on how rare that kind of collective restraint had become. In many public moments, silence is treated as a problem to solve, a gap to be filled. At the funeral, silence was allowed to stand. That allowance required trust. Trust in one another. Trust in the moment. Trust that nothing essential would be lost if nothing was said. This trust felt radical, especially in a culture that prizes immediacy and articulation. The impact of that trust extended beyond grief. People found themselves more willing to tolerate discomfort in other areas of life. Difficult conversations were approached with less urgency to conclude. Uncertainty was met with curiosity rather than fear. The silence from the funeral had modeled a different way of being present, one that valued attention over resolution. Billy noticed that his own relationship with humor had shifted slightly. He still loved it, still relied on it, but he no longer felt compelled to use it as a shield. There were moments when he chose not to deflect sadness, allowing it to exist alongside levity rather than replacing it. This balance felt healthier, more honest. It honored the complexity of his experience rather than simplifying it. Those who had known Rob well saw these changes as consistent with his influence. Rob had never discouraged humor, but he had never required it either. He believed that laughter mattered most when it emerged naturally, not when it was deployed to manage discomfort. Billy's evolving approach felt like an extension of that belief, carried forward through experience rather than instruction. As time passed, people spoke less about the breakdown itself and more about what it revealed. They spoke about the depth of friendship that had existed between two men whose public personas were often defined by entertainment. They spoke about the cost of that depth, the way it leaves an absence that cannot be filled easily. They spoke about the courage it takes to let that absence be visible. The funeral, in retrospect, felt less like an endpoint and more like a passage, a moment that marked transition rather than conclusion. The silence that followed Billy's breakdown served as a threshold, allowing grief to move from shock into something more enduring. It did not resolve anything. It allowed something to continue. Billy carried this understanding with him as he returned to work, to public life, to conversations that had nothing to do with loss. The grief did not disappear. It integrated, informed how he listened, how he responded, how he chose when to speak and when to wait. These changes were not dramatic. They were subtle, but they mattered. Others who had been present carried similar shifts. They found themselves more attentive to the emotional undercurrents in rooms, more aware of what was not being said, more willing to pause rather than rush toward explanation. The silence from the funeral had become a shared reference point, a quiet agreement that not everything needs to be articulated to be understood, that I end this way. The moment transcended its immediate context. It became a lesson in presence, in restraint, in the power of collective care. It demonstrated that grief, when met with patience, can deepen connection rather than isolate. That silence, when chosen rather than avoided, can communicate respect more clearly than words. Rob Reiner's influence was evident in this outcome. He had spent his life trusting people to find their way through complexity without control. The room at his funeral had done exactly that. They had trusted the moment. They had trusted one another. And in doing so, they had honored him in a way no scripted tribute could have achieved. Billy Crystal's breakdown was not the defining feature of the funeral. It was the opening through which something more enduring emerged. A shared understanding that love leaves marks that cannot be smoothed over, that grief deserves space, and that sometimes the most meaningful response is to remain present without interference. As the memory of that day continued to settle, it did not demand retelling. It simply remained, influencing behavior quietly, persistently. It reminded those who had been there that some moments change us not because they are loud, but because they are true. As the memory of that day continued to recede into the background of everyday life, its influence remained quietly active, shaping how people responded to moments that demanded emotional honesty. The silence at the funeral had not faded into insignificance. Instead, it had become a kind of internal reference, something people returned to when words felt insufficient or when the urge to explain threatened to overwhelm the need to simply be present. Billy Crystal felt this most clearly in private moments, when the absence of Rob Reiner surfaced unexpectedly. It happened while driving familiar routes, while watching films they had once discussed in detail, while hearing a joke that Rob would have appreciated. In those moments, Billy no longer felt the need to translate the ache into something lighter. He allowed it to exist as it was. The breakdown at the funeral had removed the illusion that pain needed conversion. It had taught him that grief could be held without being reshaped. He reflected often on how Rob had approached endings throughout his life. Rob did not believe in tying things up neatly. He believed in leaving space for reflection, for meaning to unfold over time. That philosophy had informed his work, his friendships, and ultimately, the way he was mourned. The silence at the funeral felt like the purest expression of that belief, an ending that resisted conclusion and instead invited continuation. Others who had known Rob recognized the same pattern. They spoke about how his presence had often made room for others to slow down, to think more carefully, to feel more deeply. He did not push conversations forward aggressively. He let them breathe. The room at his funeral had mirrored that approach instinctively, creating a moment that felt less like a disruption and more like alignment. The collective restraint shown that day continued to stand out in people's memories. In a world accustomed to commentary and reaction, the absence of immediate response felt radical. It demonstrated that not every moment requires interpretation. Some moments require protection. The silence protected Billy's grief from becoming spectacle. It protected Rob's legacy from being reduced to a list of achievements. It protected everyone present from the pressure to perform. Billy noticed that this understanding changed how he related to audiences afterward. He became less concerned with maintaining a consistent persona and more interested in showing up honestly. There were moments when he paused longer than expected, when he allowed seriousness to remain without punctuating it. These pauses were not rehearsed. They were learned. They carried the imprint of that day. People responded differently to him as well. There was less expectation that he would always be entertaining, more willingness to meet him where he was. This shift felt like a gift, one that emerged not from intention, but from authenticity. By allowing himself to be seen in grief, he had invited others to respond with care rather than demand. The moment also prompted reflection among those who had not been present. Friends and colleagues who heard about it often expressed gratitude that it had not been turned into a public spectacle. They appreciated that it had remained largely unspoken, shared through quiet recollection rather than amplification. This restraint preserved the integrity of the moment, allowing it to remain human rather than symbolic. Over time, the silence at the funeral began to feel less like an event and more like a shared understanding. It influenced how people approached their own losses, how they allowed space for others to grieve, how they resisted the urge to rush toward closure. It suggested that grief does not need to be solved to be respected, and that presence can be more supportive than explanation. Billy carried this understanding forward as he navigated life without Rob. The loss did not become easier, but became more integrated. He no longer measured his grief against expectations. He trusted its rhythm. Some days it was quiet. Other days it resurfaced sharply. Both were acceptable. Both were honest that he often thought about how Rob would have responded to the moment at the funeral. He imagined Rob observing the silence, recognizing it as something genuine, something unforced. He believed Rob would have appreciated that nothing was rushed, that no one tried to smooth over what was happening. That belief brought comfort. It framed the breakdown not as a loss of control, but as a final collaboration between friends, one rooted in trust rather than planning. Those who had been there continued to carry the memory in subtle ways. They noticed when they allowed silence in conversations where they once would have filled it. They noticed when they chose patience over immediacy. These changes were not dramatic, but they were meaningful. They reflected a deeper shift in how people related to emotion and to one another. In this sense, the funeral had achieved something unexpected. It had not only honored Rob Reiner's life, it had extended his influence beyond it. The values he had lived by had manifested in the behavior of those mourning him, shaping a moment that could not have been scripted. Billy Crystal's breakdown remained part of that moment, not as a focal point, but as an opening. Through it, the room had accessed a deeper truth about connection, loss, and respect. That truth did not require repetition. It lived on quietly, influencing choices and shaping responses long after the service ended. As people moved forward, the silence from that day continued to offer guidance. It reminded them that not everything meaningful arrives with words, that some bonds are best honored through presence, and that grief, when met with patience, can deepen rather than diminish what remains. As the memory of that silence continued to settle into something almost permanent, it became clear that it had altered the emotional landscape for those who experienced it. It was no longer tied to a single day or a single room. It surfaced quietly in later moments, when words failed again, when grief returned without warning, when presence felt more honest than explanation. The silence had taught them that not everything meaningful needs narration, and that restraint can sometimes speak with greater force than articulation. Billy Crystal carried this understanding into the months that followed, not as a lesson learned intellectually, but as something absorbed through experience. He noticed how his sense of time had changed. The urgency he once felt to move past pain no longer dominated his reactions. He allowed himself to sit with absence, to acknowledge the space Rob had occupied and now left behind. This sitting was not passive. It was attentive, deliberate, and surprisingly grounding that he reflected often on how Rob had shaped his sense of loyalty. Rob believed loyalty was not loud. It did not announce itself through declarations or gestures. It showed up quietly, consistently, over time. Billy realized that the breakdown at the funeral had been an extension of that loyalty. It was not a failure to maintain composure. It was an inability to pretend that the loss could be contained. In that sense, it was honest in the way Rob had always valued most. Others who had been present came to similar conclusions. They no longer remembered the funeral as an event defined by speeches or structure. They remembered it as a moment defined by shared restraint, by the collective decision to protect vulnerability rather than rush past it. That decision lingered, influencing how they approached their own moments of loss and how they responded to others in pain. The silence also changed how people spoke about Rob Reiner's legacy. Beyond the films, beyond the accolades, there was a growing emphasis on the environment he created around himself, an environment where people felt safe enough to stop performing, safe enough to be uncertain, safe enough to grieve without apology. The moment at the funeral felt like a final expression of that environment, one that required no direction because it had already been taught through years of example. Billy often imagined what Rob might have said if he had witnessed the moment. He believed Rob would not have commented on the breakdown itself. He would have noticed the room, the way people waited, the way no one intervened, the way silence was allowed to do its work. That, Billy felt, was the truest measure of respect. Not what was said, but what was permitted as time moved forward. The story of that moment resisted embellishment. It remained simple. A man tried to speak about his friend and could not. A room understood and waited. Nothing more was required. That simplicity preserved its power. It prevented the moment from becoming symbolic or performative. It remained human. The silence also served as a reminder that grief does not end with ceremonies. It continues in quieter ways, woven into daily life. It appears in pauses, in hesitations, in moments when laughter catches unexpectedly. Billy learned to recognize these moments without resisting them. He trusted that they were not signs of weakness, but of connection still at work. Those who had not been present but later heard about the moment often responded with a sense of recognition rather than surprise. They understood instinctively what it meant to reach a point where language no longer suffices. The story resonated because it reflected an experience many had lived privately but rarely seen honored publicly, that I end this way. The moment at Rob Reiner's funeral transcended its setting. It became a quiet example of how grief can be held with dignity, how silence can function as care, and how authenticity can emerge without intention. Billy Crystal's breakdown did not interrupt the farewell. It completed it, allowing the depth of love and loss to appear without filter. His life continued. The silence remained available, not as something to recreate, but as something to remember. It reminded those who encountered it that presence matters more than polish, that patience can be a form of respect, and that sometimes the most powerful tribute is to stop speaking and allow truth to be felt. Rob Reiner's life had been shaped by storytelling, by an understanding of timing, tone, and restraint. The moment at his funeral reflected those same values, not through planning, but through instinct. It revealed a legacy that extended beyond work into the way people treated one another in moments of vulnerability. Billy carried that legacy forward, not as an obligation, but as a natural continuation of a bond that had shaped him. He did not need to explain it. He lived it in the pauses he allowed, in the honesty he no longer avoided, in a respect he showed for moments that could not be rushed. And so the silence endured, not as an absence, but as a presence, a quiet testament to friendship, loss, and the courage to remain still when movement would have been easier. In that silence, Rob Reiner was remembered not only for what he created, but for the space he made possible. A space where grief could speak without words, and where love, even in loss, remained unmistakably alive.